So thank you everyone for joining. We're really excited at this being the first of 2020, but also the first of this leadership group since Diana and Mark had handed things over. Tonight we want to do a discussion on security and privacy, but I'll take you through the agenda really quickly. I'm Susan, obviously of the four.
I'm Scott, and obviously, let's see.
We have Jeremy as well.
There it is.
There we go, great. So that, in the spirit of that, we have a quick agenda. We want to do some introductions of not just ourselves, but of everyone, because it's been a while since we've all been together. And then we'll do the discussion, voice security and privacy. This is a little bit discussion, mostly AMA. And we have Damian here, and I can share a little bit more. And then we want to have an open forum. In lieu of kind of having networking and the meetups that would happen in person, what we just want to do is have an open forum where you can kind of share things, and we can just talk about things that are off, basically that are off topic, and we can go down that path, and then we'll have a close and go from there.
All right. So
from introductions per our email, I'm Susan Westwater. I'm CEO, sorry, of Pragmatic Digital, and this is Scott here with me as well. I'm friends of Diana and Mark, and so coming down this path, really excited to be going at voice from a content perspective and a UX perspective and digital strategy. I do conversation design as part of one of my many things that we work with within our strategy group. But we have presented at Voice Global just recently, but also Voice Summit, as well as Project Voice.
And someone else just joined, so I'm trying to let them in.
Oh, sure.
Great.
There
we go. Perfect. And I'm Scott Westwater. I'm the CCO of Pragmatic Digital. And, I think a few of you have seen us here at the UVS Chicago Meetups. And as Susan said, we've been doing presentations with Voice Global, Voice Summit, Project Voice. We wrote a book on voice strategy. And so our goal and our hope for the UVS Chicago group is to really build the community here in Chicago. Generally you see a lot of representation on the coast. So a lot of activity in New York, a lot of activity in the West Coast. And it's kind of unfortunate that, Chicago is often overlooked when it comes to technology, startups, and especially voice. So what we're hoping to do is really foster a rich community here in Chicago, getting the business community involved and really helping them understand what this opportunity is for them so that we can all, share in that success. So that's, just in a real quick nutshell, what our hope is for UVS Chicago and how, we can really help foster that community that's already been established, that's already, growing, and it's 200 people plus strong, and we'd like to just keep continuing to grow. Jeremy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jeremy Cadiz. I'm currently working as a researcher in the education space, but I also studied UX design last year. And I, as a member of this group last year, I discovered voice, and I really wanted to really get into explore this space. And like Scott and Susan said, want to kind of evangelize the whole technology. It seems like there's so many things that I see in terms of education and language that I see a lot of a big future in voice. So that's why I want to get involved. Nice to meet everyone.
Awesome. All right, so then we'd love to have everyone introduce yourselves. I think we've met a few of you at previous meetups, but Richard, why don't you start?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Richard Alvarez. I am the UX practice lead at a consulting company here in Chicago called Sageza. It's about 700 plus firm of consultants worldwide. We're headquartered in Chicago, but I started up a UX group, research and design, mostly discovery for our client partners here in Chicago. So we're a 12-person team. We are engaged in everything UX and agile integration for product development, but we've also like to hang our hat on emerging technologies, specifically voice. So kind of like your introduction said, we've been looking for ways to participate in a community engaged in voice, what it means, where it's going. Couldn't find it, and I did attend the first UVS with Diana, and I think I sporadically attended a couple other ones, so I'm not a familiar face, but I hope to be more of a regular moving forward.
Excellent. All right, Tim.
I am Tim Cruz. It's very nice to meet you all. I'm with a company called Shreejan. We are a digital agency, so really happy to see a number of folks on the digital side. I am the digital experience manager. My focus is on new business development as well. So very limited exposure to voice, although Shreejan has been doing it. I heard of the group, Scott, from a tweet you sent out. One of my colleagues was actually talking at the Voice Global Summit as well. So we build primarily on the Drupal content management system. But as Richard mentioned, you know, emerging technologies, we're doing some really interesting things, not only with voice, but conversational bots and things like that as well. So I third the notion to, you know, rise the tides here in Chicago as well. So thanks for having me. This is my first time sitting in on one of these, and I do have to pre-apologize as well. I have my mother-in-law is coming over and not too long from now, and as we've all been in lockdown and things like that, I think you could all appreciate it too. So I'm really happy that this is being recorded as well, because I really didn't want to pull away. So this could maybe be the best of both worlds.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for coming. Imelda. And you're muted.
You're muted. Can you unmute?
Let's see. Can I unmute her?
Hit that.
Move your mouse on the screen. You'll see the unmute come up. And there you go.
There you go.
Sorry about that. I had it on mute because I was listening to you guys.
I was trying to figure out how to unmute
Yeah,
it.
so it's such good manners, right?
Anyways, nice getting reacquainted with you guys. I met you at the Grand Studio last year when you launched your book and everything else, and I've been ever since been following what you're doing, and it's really exciting to be part of the community. I'm a digital designer. I work for a digital agency, and we primarily deal with dental practices on the social media design side of things. And I have an interest in voice because it's kind of the way of the future. With all the new technology that's coming out, with the new apparatus out there, a lot of it is voice driven and also kind of signal driven. So voice and that type of motion control is kind of advancing and moving up the, should I say, up the field. And I wanted to be part of it. And since we just merged, you know, launched this in Chicago, I want to be part of it. So I'm excited about it.
Awesome. And we're super excited to have you. So thank you for coming. Andy.
Hi, I'm Andy Bellavia. I work for a company called Knowles out of Itasca, although I live in Woodstock. And this is my second meetup. The first one I went to, I think might have been the last in-person one. And I have to say, meeting people in person is great, although it's balanced by the fact that I didn't have to do a 2-hour train and bus ride to get here. I just had to walk downstairs and get something to nibble on and come back to my office. And I came into voice a little bit sideways because our company makes small microphones and speakers that go into hearing aids, music earphones, mobile phones, and our microphones ended up in the Amazon Echo. So when we got an early Amazon Echo, I'll never forget the first thing I ever did. I walked in, I said, "Oh, that's that interesting thing. What do? Talk to it?" You know, and so I walked up to it and I said, "Hey, Alexa, play some Pink Floyd for me." And Pink Floyd came out of the speaker. Wow, this is really cool. So I started to, you know, learn what this was all about. And then when hearables came, our microphones and speakers ended up in hearables because they're very small, like the, you know, the hearing aid speakers. And so I was involved in, you know, from the very beginning with all the early hearable people like Doppler and Variety and those people. And eventually hearables became used with voice assistants as well. And that's, you know, one of the things I expect hearables to be driven by in the future is on-the-go voice assistant access. You can see it with, like, for example, the Echo Buds.
Right.
where you can do hands-free Alexa, and they have actually 2 of our speakers and a woofer tweeter combo in it. So I'm not writing for voice. However, I'm involved in voice in terms of supporting hardware.
Yeah. Very cool.
Nice to meet all of you. Of course, I know some of you already, but it's nice to meet those of you whom I have not met before. And looking forward to in person.
Someday soon, hopefully.
Yes.
All right, Nick.
Hey everybody, my name is Nick Myers and I'm very excited to be here. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Scott and Susan pretty well over the last couple of years, and Andy, of course, and they invited me to this meetup. I'm actually in Madison, Wisconsin right now, but we are not lucky enough to have a Ubiquitous Voice Society in Wisconsin, so I'm going to just, through the power of tech, just transport myself out to the city here. But I actually grew up in Naperville, so I have roots in Chicago. So you have no idea how happy I was when we finally got a Portillo's here in Madison. But over the last couple of years, I actually have founded my own company. I'm the CEO of that company called Red Fox AI, and we help medium to enterprise level companies leverage voice assistant tech. So we do consulting, we build Alexa skills, Google Actions, and we do education as well. I've been insanely lucky to kind of niche myself out as a speaker in artificial intelligence. I'm just kind of a geek for all of that and voice, and been able to kind of bop around the US and even went to some different countries last year. But yeah, I'm a marketer by trade, and ever since I ordered my first pack of toilet paper from Alexa back in early 2018, I've been hooked, and now it's my career. So insanely happy to be here and meet you all and be a part of this.
Awesome. Alan.
There we go. Got to get off mute. Thank you very much. I'm Alan Smith. I'm the Vice President of Business Development with V2 Verify. So you're going to be hearing today from Damian, who's our CEO and founder. And just wanted to let everybody know I'm here to support any additional questions you might have, especially after the session's over. And my contact info is just simple alan.smith, ALAN.smith at V2 Verify, and that's V2 Verify.com. So I'll go back on mute and let the rest of your introductions go. But I can say I'm a Yankee in Nebraska. Go figure how that works. So thanks.
Thanks for joining us. All right. Well, people keep popping in and popping out. So, all right. So then, last but not least, I'd like to introduce you to Damian De Rozario. Damian's the CEO of Voice2 Verify, as Alan just said, and he's got over 30 years of experience in enterprise payment, banking, and really the reason we brought him in is he and his organization have a really fascinating tool and approach to voice biometrics, specifically when it comes to security. So literally using your voice to authenticate that you are, in fact, who you say you are. And so we got to know these guys, both Alan and Damian, after the Voice Summit last year, and thought, with this being the topic, who better to have on than someone whose company actually does this exact thing for a living. So Damian, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit, and then we can get into the discussion.
Sure. So yeah, like Scott said, being in the enterprise, have a history in the enterprise payment and banking industry around 30 years. So I came at Voice understanding security and customer experience. And as most of you have said in your introductions here, that you came into Voice from the perspective of having an Alexa or having some sort of a device and being able to speak to it. So our theory and what we wanted to build is an ecosystem that can take that speech. So while you're giving a command, whether you're ordering your toilet, your pack of toilet paper, or asking it to play some music, use that exact same speech to actually authenticate you, so that if there was a purchase made, that we know that the right person made the purchase. If it was a song being played with explicit language, that it was the adult in the house that is making that request rather than a child. So we came at it from the perspective that we wanted to be able to take free form speech, any type of speech, and authenticate. And what we have today is an ecosystem that can do that with basically 2 seconds of speech. So by the time you get done saying your phone number, we can authenticate you and match your voice to a voice print that we have and actually confirm or deny your identity. And so that's where we come from.
And it's really incredibly fascinating. In conversations with Damian and with Alan, we've heard stories about big banks and a lot of the fraud that happens at the big banks. And by using this technology, the banks were able to basically isolate those people that were causing a lot of the fraud and, quite frankly, the loss for the organization. And were able to block them from being able to call into their phone system and actually do what they were doing. So it's just a really cool technology, and it's kind of this like perfect merger of voice technology and security and ultimately privacy, which is a big kind of offshoot of the security part of it. So
yeah, and one of the things that's always fascinated me, and I think Alan, you had shared so much about it with your passion when we were talking at Voice Summit, is the whole concept of how it is that you can do this off of 2 seconds. And the differences of how you can make a voice print, as opposed to, I think the question I had was, my mom and I sound the same on the phone. How does that work? How can that be then that you can tell us apart? If you could share a little bit about that, obviously sharing any trade secrets, I think it's a really interesting way of helping folks understand how that works from a security and a privacy perspective.
So let me start off from here saying that, for some of you folks may remember the days before we had caller ID and mobile phones. In that day and age, we were still able to pick up the phone, listen to someone, and most often we were able to actually identify the person because the human brain was actually able to tell the difference in the voices. So our real goal at the start was to just be able to try to figure out a way to digitize it. Now, when I started asking this question around the mid-90s, most people thought I was nuts, trying to say, what are you trying to do? But kept asking the question enough times, and I've eventually found engineers that said, maybe this is something, a possibility. Now, from a privacy and a security perspective, what we do is we look at the wave patterns that are created when a person speaks. Now, there's 2 parts of that wave pattern. There is a part that the human ear can hear, which is what you're hearing me speak. But at the same time, I'm creating tones that you cannot hear, that is not non-audible. And we found that there is more uniqueness in the non-audible section. And so we use a lot of the non-audible speech as a part of our verification. So for example, we cannot do a verification or a match of an MP3 file because in the MP3 world, what they do is they compress the file by actually eliminating the non-audible section of the music or whatever you're listening to. Whereas, so when you remove that section, we cannot verify off that because we just don't have enough granularity or enough information. You give us a WAV file, which actually includes that information, because if you actually ever notice, if you ever try to convert a WAV file to an MP3, the MP3 is like 10% of the size of a WAV file. And the reason is that we work off that inaudible section of the speech. And from a privacy and a security perspective, what we also do is because we're working on that area that no one can hear, the ability for someone to reverse engineer a voice becomes fairly difficult. So things like people who mimic speech, people who are good actors, they can't create that speech that you can hear because they're actually working on the section that you can hear. So that provides us us the ability to make sure that our technology is secure enough that you cannot really find a way to reverse engineer what we create. But beyond that, we also drop a major part of the speech. So we don't actually build a voice print of every tone you make. It's only some of the tones you make. So that therefore, even if you were figuring out what tones we actually captured, it's near impossible to reverse engineer it. And then we add a liveness component to it. So we actually make sure that when you're speaking, it's not a recording. It's not a high quality recording that's being played back. And because we use random speech, it doesn't mean it's not scripted speech, which means that, when you talk about voice biometrics, most companies look at it and say, well, you can have a passphrase like, my voice is my password or something like that. We work off pure random speech. So we can then ask you a question. We can say, what day of the week is it today? And expect you to give us the right answer or show you 4 numbers or tell you, say the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and then validate the answer, not just the speech, but also that you said the right thing. And that provides a second level of, liveness as well as a 2-factor authentication. But if you imagine that and take that back to the context of where most of you are working, you're working to present your customer with a great experience. But if you can then incorporate security into that great experience without making them type a password, repeat something, remember something, it's kind of the ideal marriage of great customer experience and great security at the same time.
Yeah, that's always the difficult thing. And a lot of projects I've worked on, especially in the app world, it's always a more of a focus on the security versus the customer experience. And it's really hard, for the audience to either sign in, recover their password, like whatever the case might be. So like I'm really interested to see how this plays out, because I know from talking to you guys, this isn't just a smart speaker technology. This is something that can apply to smartphone apps. This is something that can apply to phone systems. This is something that can actually apply to computers and websites. And so like the idea that I may never need to remember and recover my password is incredibly exciting to me.
Right, and the extension of just the beyond the biometric, the extension of that is that we consider this seamless authentication now. So say I'm trying to transact with my bank, and I get on the bank's mobile app, and I'm logging in there, and I'm trying to do something, and I find out that like a lot of mobile apps compared to portals, that there is some functionality missing. So I need to do something, and I need to move to my laptop. The idea is, why would I need to re-authenticate if I move to my laptop? Why can't I carry over the authentication I already done on the mobile app? So basically, you bring up your bank's portal, the portal will provide you a QR code, a barcode, you scan that with the mobile app, and bang, you're logged in. So it's actually, it's carrying forward that authentication through your day and through the processes you go through in the day. And based on security levels, so some situations you may have to authenticate every time, some situations you may not. But being able to do that, and then to your point also, when people use passwords or use the biometric embedded in a device like your facial recognition or your fingerprint readers in a mobile device, if you lose that mobile device or you don't have it or you replace it, you need to remember a password to get back into re-onboard onto the next device you get.
Right.
Well, our theory is that means that you got to remember a password. And if you got to remember a password, what are you going to do? You're going to remember the easiest password you can or reuse it across all platforms. There goes your security, right? So what we've done is we've actually removed that burden from the user and said, we're going to cloud-base this. Because most people won't use their mobile phone unless they got a cloud connection anyway, because you can't get to your bank, you can't get to your portals, you can't get to anything without a connection to the internet. So if you're connected to the internet, why not put the biometric in the cloud so that if you are calling in over the phone, you're using a mobile app, you're using a speaker on a laptop, you should still be able to authenticate using the exact same method. So really what we're talking about is an omni-channel or a single way of authenticating across every channel that you can interact between companies and their employees or companies and their customers. And that, if you can increase the customer experience and security, but also reduce cost, because you're not actually talking to a human, because that's where your biggest cost is. Yep. I mean, that's kind of the perfect solution.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I know Richard can attest to this, like just the concept of removing friction or minimizing friction is really what user experience is all about. And so what you're talking about is a frictionless experience where just by listening in a couple seconds of speech that you can say, yep, you are in fact who you say you are, we'll let you in, or no, you're not who you say you are, and there's a method to recover. That is incredibly powerful. And you think about how much time is wasted recovering passwords and logging in, and on the healthcare side there's the patient portals, and it's just all the stuff that we create generally that's also in silos. Like, it's really nice to know that there's a solution that exists that would actually be able to go across multiple touch points, so you truly have one point of access, and then you can just get into whatever system you're trying to interact with.
Right. And the other part of it is, because we're using random numbers, it actually automatically includes a two-factor authentication. So you got your voice as your first factor. You got the randomized numbers, like sending out a text pin, as your second factor. So you got two-factor authentication in one process. Simplifies the authentication process. And then you look at how one of the interesting things I think in the near future is going to be, just before COVID came along, what the government was trying to do, especially on the healthcare field, they were trying to ban the use of text-based two-factor authentication to get access to patient portals. because they believed it wasn't being safe. So that means that people are going to have to go to some sort of tokenization, whether it's a physical piece of hardware or a piece of software. That becomes very cumbersome. So you can actually get two-factor out of the one amount of speech. And the speech, because it can be anything, you can actually ask them, give me an employee ID or give me something that identifies what you're trying to do. So, read out your account number so I know what balance to give you, whatever it is. And we can use that speech as a two-factor authentication. That, puts us in a great place. And then in a post-COVID world, we see that speech is going to be the way. See, it's the only touchless biometric that's viable anymore. I mean, facial recognition is going by the wayside. IBM's pulled out last week. Microsoft and Amazon put a hold on it. And I don't know whether you saw that on NPR today that we actually posted onto our LinkedIn page today, where an individual was detained based on a facial recognition scan. It was an African-American gentleman that was detained for a crime that he didn't commit. And when you actually look at the pictures, it doesn't look like it's the same person, but he was held for 30 hours before they actually proved that he wasn't the right person. So facial itself is having problems, and then you throw a mask on it. And most facial companies today will tell you, we can do it with a mask on, but all they've reduced the number of points. Most facial works off, starting from the center of your nose, measuring to your mouth and all that. They've now reduced the number of points and said, we're just going to measure the information we have at your eye level and authenticate you off that. So they've reduced the threshold for passing. And also then you're inducing this other risk. And to add to that is a privacy issue, because you can be walking down the street and there's a camera, either in a public place or whatever, and they're looking at your face. They can actually be using facial recognition to try to identify you. So there's some privacy concerns around this, where countries like Australia at the moment are looking at banning facial recognition for anything but government use. The European countries are looking at the same. Whereas voice, you still have control. Because if you stop speaking, you cannot be identified. So there is that part of the whole privacy thing that comes into play too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, it's one of those things where like the genie's kind of out of the bottle and we don't really know what we don't know about unintended consequences of certain technologies. And certainly facial recognition is definitely in the news in the past like 2 to 3 weeks pretty heavily. So, and quite frankly, I didn't know that they were just reducing the amount of data that they were working from. I mean, it makes sense, but I didn't know actually what they were doing to try to validate with someone with a mask on. So.
Well, yeah, they're basically reducing the data points because the data points generally are the identifiable data points. So they're looking at the end of the lips, but when you get a mask on, you're covering most of the data points that they're going to use. So all you got is eyes left now, right? Yeah. So the less data points, the less secure the system is going to be, which means you got to crank down the level of security to try to get people to go through.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things you had talked about when we were chatting was, as a security strategy, you really don't want it to be, it's better to, ideally is 100% perfection, but it's better to have more false negatives than false positives. Can you talk a little bit more about that strategy behind that, of how kind of thinking through I would rather let fewer people in and have to do another thing than letting in too many people, depending on as you're thinking through your security strategies of how people can get access to things.
Well, absolutely. So when I'll compare it to facial, because that seems to be one of the touchless biometrics that we're all going to have to go to at some point post-COVID. When you look at facial recognition, what you're really doing is looking at a snapshot of a person right now, and you're getting the points and matching it and coming up with a probability whether the person's right or wrong. The beauty about speech is it's a behavioral biometric, which means that if I'm not sure, I can just ask you to speak more. I can continue to ask you to speak more. I can continue to engage with you till I'm sure. So I'm not taking one picture at one moment in time. I can actually stretch that out to as long as I need to confirm you're right or wrong. So the way we've got our systems set up and the way we build our systems is really geared towards eliminating the false positives. So not letting the wrong person in ever, which means that you are going to have some level of wrong, false negatives. But by increasing the amount of speech, we can eliminate those false negatives. And to a point where we actually ran, just before COVID, we ran a POC in Vietnam. We actually had 50 Vietnamese people from different parts of the country actually run some tests, and there was a customer was running this was their own testing methodology. And we walked away with a 99.4% accuracy out of that POC with thousands of test cases run. Now, that means we had 0 false accepts, so we didn't never let the wrong person in. Now, we didn't let the right person in sometimes, but we ended up at 99.4%. Now, the interesting thing about this is my COO, our COO, was not on the call today, actually ended up going there to man the POC and monitor it. And the moment the first person walked in the room, he calls me up and says, Damian, we got trouble. I said, what's up? And he says, well, they're wearing masks. Didn't you not know this? Because I'd only been in Vietnam the week before. I said, well, it's too late now. We just got to go with it and see how this pans out. 96% of the people, 47 people, wore masks that they brought from home. So they were not anything that we provided them. They were, different variations of masks, different thicknesses, cloth, paper, whatever they were wearing. And we still achieved that 99.4% accuracy, which, is pretty incredible in a biometric in a world where, your speech is really impacted by that mask.
Right.
Yeah. So obviously Scott and I have 100 questions that we can ask all day. I want to definitely invite anyone, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Damian, please chime in and join in. We want to definitely make this a discussion. So just want to let everyone know that we're open to just a Q&A, just very similar like that.
I just wanted to jump in really quickly, kind of assessing everything we've talked about so far, what you guys have mentioned. I couldn't agree with you more on the, Damian, you talked a little bit about how our brain works and how we are able to decipher someone's voice, someone familiar to us, instantaneously. It's just an innate feature that we have. And I think that the more I think about, the user experience when it comes to different design patterns, biometrics versus, more traditional authentication methods, this is the most natural way for us to communicate as humans, is just naturally to kind of identify ourselves. If I was not working on a computer, I might ask someone at the door, who is it? And they would tell me, and I would recognize the voice, or I wouldn't. And I might ask a little bit more. Wait a minute, you sound a little funny. What's going on there? I was going to follow up on that question about, but if the facial recognition is a moment in time versus just ongoing conversation that you can have with a person to kind of decipher and maybe filter through and say, the first time it wasn't a pass, second time I got a little bit more, I picked it up. I guess my question is, are we as humans, are we conscious of the fact that we have this, you talked about the hidden or unspoken or unaudible signature that's part of that, data that's part of that signature? Are we conscious that we're doing that? Do we know if I authenticate myself when I have a cold, or under some circumstances my voice maybe not sounding the same, is it still coming through? Do I know what I'm doing?
No, as humans, we're not conscious of what we're doing, right? So that speech, and this is also proven in the fact that if you take people as they age, so take our parents or people we know that are aging, their hearing range drops out, and their ability to hear drops out as they get older. Now that doesn't mean that I'm speaking any different, because I'm still speaking the same. I'm still speaking the same volume. I'm still speaking the same way. My voice has really not changed. Their ability to pick up on that audible range keeps dropping out. So that really is, from the easiest way to explain it is that what we speak doesn't change. It's what we hear is what changes over time. Whereas with a computer, because it's a microphone, it's going to hear everything all the time. It doesn't differentiate what it hears.
Yeah, I just want to chime in quick and say that as you were talking about the nonverbal tones that we make when speaking, it immediately made me think of this show that actually was on HBO last summer called Years and Years. And the whole premise of the show is they would jump forward like every 5-10 years. And of course, everything got more technological. And near the end of the show, one of the ways that people would identify themselves when they would almost do anything is they would blow on this device. And it was explained in the show they would blow on it because apparently it was catching the nonverbal tones that people would make as a biometric identifier. So I just think that's completely awesome. That's essentially what you've created, because I'm like, I just saw this in a show. Oh my God. But aside from that, my little geek out moment is, you know, I really see a lot of value, of course, moving forward with audio biometrics for commerce, especially an area that we're working in now, where we're trying to develop a quote unquote voice commerce product. The challenge is that, you know, if you buy something on Alexa or specifically, you have to have a code that you say every single time. It doesn't necessarily just know who you are to pre-approve the payment. So the struggle now is you're adding something else that somebody has to remember necessarily, instead of it just automatically identifying you and your voice, which is funny because they have the ability now, you know, to create like a persona for yourself on the device. But I think this is really going to be crucial, especially as we see the evolution of people buying more things via Google Assistant, Alexa, or any other voice assistant that comes to light here. And I think it's going to be a technology like you have that really causes that explosion to create that trust and security.
Right, and yeah, then there's another area too beyond that, is that one is also, as we age, it becomes harder and harder to remember things like passwords and PINs. And depending on the number of digits, I mean, there's a lot of studies done about why, you know, credit card numbers are written in chunks of 4, because it's easier for us to read chunks of 4 numbers than 6 or 8. And that's why, you know, Amex cards are really hard to read the numbers out, just because they're not actually in chunks of 4. But it's the same as you get older, memory starts becoming a problem. And then you also look at the, you know, like if you look at the world, the underbanked, and there's like 40% of the world's population is underbanked because they're illiterate and they can't actually figure out how to read or write or type numbers or anything like that. So when you get into a voice situation where in our technology, because it's tone-based, it's not language-based. So any tone you're making, we can use to identify. So no matter what language you're speaking, what accent you're speaking, we're going to be able to identify you. We're reducing that need to remember things. And we're also opening up markets, because, you know, while we are fairly, you know, most people in the US can read and write and do all that, you're looking at the African continent and looking through Southeast Asia, that is some of the attraction we're seeing, is that when you're expanding into that world, you really need to be able to deal with people that know how to use a phone, because they were almost born with a phone in their hand, but they still can't read and write, right? So having speech, and speech is, you know, like Richard said, speech is natural to us. We talk to everything, and we're getting more and more used to talking to our cars, to our phones, to Alexa, to everything. So when you combine the two together, and with what you guys are doing from making the experience great, and what we're doing from adding identification to it, I think it's really the best of both worlds for the future, as far as how we authenticate and transact and interact with each other.
Yeah, and I really do think that voice is going to become the great equalizer from access standpoint. So imagine what happens if, you know, let's say it's 25% of the world's population hasn't had access to the information we all take for granted. And whether it's literacy or language or a whole host of reasons, access to technology, like because of low cost or practically no cost smart speakers, you know, people are going to have access to information that they've never had access to before. And so what does that do for the worldwide community, where, you know, again, people are going to have this knowledge that they've never been able to access before. And then on top of it, you remove the literacy requirement. Like within healthcare, we're always writing for like a 5th grade reading level, because that's generally, when you're talking about health literacy in the US, what that level is. So by being able to understand however people are interacting with you, but also if you can authenticate them, then actually say this person needs to be talked to in this way, or maybe there is a regionality thing, or whatever the different considerations are, which goes to a conversation we had a few weeks ago with some other folks in the voice community. The idea of creating persona-based interactions and really, you know, creating personalized experiences is what the technology is enabling. So like to be able to identify someone and like know that I'm different than Susan, and based on her preferences, let's say Alexa wants to talk to her a certain way versus talk to me a certain way, like that's now within the realm of possibility, which is incredibly exciting.
Well, absolutely. And then you take another step, is that, you know, going back to, you know, the phone call where you could pick up the phone and understand, know who it is. But there's another part that we do that we haven't thought about yet. And we can also pick up the level of stress. So we know whether the person's upset, whether they're angry, they're upset, they're sad, they hurt, whatever. So that's kind of a next part of our evolution is really sentiment analysis.
Yep.
So if I can tell you this is Damian on the phone, or Damian on the smart speaker, or Damian on an app, but he's also really upset about something. You can then, if you think about it from providing a service, you can then route that call or that message or that chatbot to someone that can actually help you reduce that friction, and get through that. And so it becomes a customer experience that starts. Imagine, in your world where you're actually trying to improve that customer experience. Imagine if I can tell you, well, the person's calling in or the person on that app is just upset.
Right.
You need to deal with it different. Don't keep them on hold. Whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
if you can make that decision, it just makes the tool so much more powerful.
Yeah.
Well, and then, to add on to that, like if someone starts a session on a smart speaker or, even within an app, let's say, by being able to authenticate them, especially when they call in, and if you're doing a pass or a handover or whatever, to know everything they've already done on that smart speaker session or on their smart app or their smartphone app, basically means you don't have to, as the operator, go back through and go, all right, so how can I help you today? What's the problem? Well, I've already entered that information 5 different places.
Yeah.
Right.
And so by being able to identify that, you are getting people to their answer quicker. And I really do think that voice is going to be a good way for us to triage certain customer service and customer experience things, where low-level things will be able to be handled by the smart speakers and the AI systems. But if they can't, there's some sort of intelligence that then hands it over to a human operator to really, solve the problem that they need. So I do see kind of like this authentication and security part of it really layering into that whole idea of improving the customer experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that the difference between authentication and customer experience is going away, because we want to have great customer experience while knowing that we're being authenticated correctly, right? Because, if, for example, if a bank, if you were dealing with your bank, and I use this, coming from my payment background and developing software, I use this example with a lot of people I've hired, and almost everyone that ever worked with me has heard this story. If your electric company makes a mistake with your bill and you call them up and say something like, well, you complain about it and they give you a $20 credit and say, look, we won't happen again, you're quite happy, and you're quite happy about the electric company. But imagine if your bank sent you a statement and they were 1 cent off on the calculation. The trust is lost forever. You will never trust that bank again. You're moving to another bank because they can't even add up. Because people treat money very differently. And in that environment where they are, when you work, especially working in the money side of things, when it's out of commodities but dealing with money, and we're doing a lot more dealing with money based on digital platforms now rather than actually going into a bank, that authentication and making sure that the person is right. So reducing the risk of breaches, it adds a lot of value to that, especially to that sector within the commerce sector.
Yeah, it makes tons of sense that you need to, as technology's improved, it supposedly gives us, quicker access, but it seems like we're on hold longer than ever. There's a lot of frustration amongst, our customers, whether it's stuff that we've designed or just, on behalf of a brand. So,
the whole prove you're not a robot. We basically spend most of the time in web experiences these days proving we're not robots.
Right.
And some of that's due to financial implications and fraud, but it is a way of how, well, then let's start with the summaries of what are the things that make us not robots, which is kind of an exciting venture. One question I do have, and I would be remiss not to ask this, so please, would be so we talked about the vulnerabilities that come with facial recognition. I think those are very clear, more than ever the failure points. What are there possible vulnerabilities with voice? Like you talked about the WAV file. Is that something that can be easily picked up? It seems to me, having just done recordings that we've had to do ourselves, getting a good enough file is kind of hard to start with. Are there other vulnerabilities or things to think about with that? Kind of put some, a little bit of a reality check.
Well, absolutely. All biometrics or all authentication modalities, whether it's passwords, pins, any biometric, they all have their downsides as much as their upsides, right? So the real issue you run into with voice generally is noise. So, I was actually going to be contacting Andrew after this call to talk about the microphones, because when we talk about kiosks and all that, we're always thinking about background noise, because background noise can really affect the way the speech patterns we pick up. But as far as the ability to steal a voice print and then convert that to a voice that someone can use to break the system, at this stage there is no ability to do that, because we've ensured that we're not maintaining every part of the person's voice spectrum in those voice files. Does that answer your question? So yeah, the vulnerability is really about how we capture the voice. It's not in how we process it. So if you have the better microphones come up, most mobile phones these days have more than one microphone. So we use a lot of noise reduction technologies or ideas or concepts, things like listening on every microphone in a mobile phone. And the iPhone has a number of microphones, some that you see, some that you don't. We listen on all of them and we delta out the noise we hear on all of them. And then we can actually speak the primary mic. We can pick up the speech out of the primary mic. We do things like that, but noise reduction is kind of an area where, there's a lot of research being done, and that is really our biggest vulnerability, is just the noise. If you can't make a phone call, the voice is not going to work.
Right.
Yeah, you actually walked into the question I was going to ask you, and that is how robust is the system in noise, because you're really relying on hardware you didn't create. Mm-hmm. So you have all manner of hardware with acoustics all over the place. And even in the smart speaker case, where you put the smart speaker is going to affect a lot. Now, you said you used inaudible tone, so I'm assuming it's sub-bass you're using. But if you, depending on the position of the smart speaker in the room, you're going to get different reflections off the walls and everything else. It's a little bit tricky, and you can have audio good enough for a human to recognize that your spouse talking, but not nearly good enough for this sort of thing. And so I guess that's my question, is you take a device that's not under your control and go into environments which are not under your control. How robust is your system then?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. So what we have is we've actually built our own AI engine that sits on top of our probability algorithms. And what the AI engine does, it has the ability to learn the environments under which you're working and adjust. So biometrics is basically a threshold-based probability algorithm, right? So you say you score above X, you pass. You score below X, you fail. It's a very simple process. What we have is, what our AI can do is it will look at every time you use it. So if you're starting to have failures, the AI kicks in and starts saying, okay, why are we failing here, right? What could potentially be, he's on a new device. Is there anything we can do to try to see whether we can pass him on that new device? And then as you start passing, because what's going to happen the way humans work is, if I'm 20 feet away from the Alexa and speak, and I don't pass, I'm going to start going closer and closer to it, speaking louder and louder. And eventually I'll get within a range where I'm actually capturing it. The AI, on the other hand, is listening to the same thing, going, okay, well, this is the same voice I'm hearing. It's just getting better and better quality. So he's obviously got an Alexa device. Let's register that device as one of his input points. And now let's adjust so that when he's on Alexa and he's 20 feet apart, we know his scoring range has actually changed from the 50s and 60s to 20s and 30s. So let's adjust the threshold on that Alexa device to bring it down so we can actually start passing you. So that's how we handle that.
Okay, interesting. And what about variability in the environment? So in other words, I might use my same mobile phone. I might talk to my mobile phone just like I am now. And if I authenticate through your system now, and then I go get on the L and I start, using the authentication again, how quickly does it respond to the change in environment?
It normally takes you a couple of times of use before it can start figuring it out. So the first time it will look at a failure and say, well, you failed. So that may be a legitimate failure. Maybe someone else trying to get in, maybe a legit failure, right? Someone's playing with the system. A couple of times in, two to three times in, it's normally going to say, well, okay, this is looking like a habit. This is not a failure. And you're right, because I'll give you another example of where that this happens. So in corporate environments, you sit in a HR office and you get onboarded. You're really calm. You're sitting down. You're onboarded. Your voice pattern is very different than when you're running into work. You're late. You're late to a meeting. You're stressed out. Your breathing patterns change. Your speech patterns change. the AI is actually capable of being able to figure that out. And it may fail you a couple of times because it's going to err on the side of caution and say, look, I'm not really sure, so I'm going to fail you. So it may make you speak more to try to pass you, or it may fail you and say, I'm going to learn out of this because this environment is changing. And then if you continue to talk on the L, it's going to say, okay, well, we know that Andrew's on this, does this. This is kind of a part of his pattern. It makes it easier for us to understand. So it's really the machine learning behind the scenes adds a lot. If you go into a completely new environment, it may fail you a couple of times, but it will start learning where you're at.
Okay, so the machine learning has persistence. If I ride the L every day, eventually it's going to adapt to the fact that sometimes I'm talking on the L and sometimes I'm not.
Right. It adapts. It constantly adapts, and there's a reason for that. Why it's required beyond your environmental conditions. It's your aging process, because as you age, your speech patterns change. So it's better for us to we call it a continuous enrollment, if you like. We're continuously onboarding you. Every time you speak, we're onboarding you. I mean, that's kind of the internal term for it. I mean, it's an AI engine. It's a genetic evolutionary AI engine that we use. It's our own engine. And what it does is it constantly listens to try to figure out the variances in your speech patterns, because that's the only way we can keep up with your aging. And therefore we can go from, say, 14 to 80 and not have you have to physically re-onboard again.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, but Andrew, I'm really definitely going to reach out to you, because I would love to be able to talk to you about microphones, because that is our challenge. Is we're working with devices we don't build, but we rely on what they capture. So being able to find some microphones for some use cases that we have at the moment that we're doing some research on, would be great to be able to talk to someone who understands microphones better than we do.
Yeah, be glad to, although mostly you're a slave to what's done after the microphone delivers the audio signal, how they're arranged and how the noise cancellation is handled and the frequency response of the entire chain, not just the mics.
Right.
But yeah, we can talk offline for sure.
Yep, definitely.
So a couple of follow-up questions, kind of changing gears a little bit, is so you're talking about this data mine that you have that is learning. And we're talking about voice, I'm going to call them voice prints, I guess, because that's
right. Yep.
Are there regulations, or have regulations even caught up to what you do with that? Like, we know that email, you can't even, Alexa even is, they say they're strict about, of like, you can't even ask for an email address unless it's related to your skill. You're not, I mean, GDPR, all those things. Is there, are there implications that have already caught up with all of this voice data that you have? Or,
there is really no regulation at this point, but we've actually started preempting this, coming from a security background. So we're actually not storing your speech. We're only storing vectors about your speech. So there is no PII being stored. So there's nothing, even if you actually spoke your account number or your password, your PIN or your date of birth or your social security number, we're not actually storing that data. We're just storing vectors about that speech pattern, and we're dropping the speech. So the speech is only active for a very short period of time in our system. Once that is done, it's gone. So the vectors themselves don't contain any PII in it, and therefore we believe we're ahead of any regulations that's coming down the road.
Can somebody recreate my speech from the vectors you have stored?
No, and the reason is what we do is, so in our original initial research, we went through millions upon millions of voices to try to figure out how the probability works. So if you actually imagine a wave pattern, what we found is that no matter what language you speak, no matter how old you are, no matter whether you're female or male, that everyone's speech, actually there is a common region of tones that everyone makes, and there is the tones that are very unique to you that people make. What we do when we build our voice prints is that we actually remove that common region, which is quite a bit of that speech pattern is removed. So the vectors we create is not a complete waveform of what your speech is like. It's only some very unique characteristics. So for example, and here's what I can tell you. So if we take your speech over 10 years and you use the system every day for 10 years, the vector file the size of the vector file doesn't change. It just improves the quality of the vector file, but the actual size of the file doesn't change. So it's not like we're collecting more and more and more data. We're just making the data better for that moment. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear that you guys are preempting any privacy concerns that might arise based on this data, because one of the things that we get all the time is, well, what about privacy? You're listening in on people. You know, these are spies in the home, if you will. And there's some people that are very heavily focused on that. And generally, like, you know, when Susan and I give talks, like, we have a couple of responses, and, you know, with the Open Voice Network, which we're both part of and ambassadors for, along with Nick, that's one of the things that we're actually working on, is how do we establish privacy guidelines and standards that we can all kind of adhere to. So it's really awesome to hear that you guys are already thinking about that and are making sure that you're not running afoul of it, because that is going to be the thing that torpedoes voice as a technology. Is one instance is going to happen where there's a data breach, and all of a sudden all kinds of data, you know, whether it's PII or PHI or a combination or whatever, through a voice system is leaked. And that's going to really set us back at least a decade. So it's nice to hear that you guys are really, you know, building that into your DNA, so that that's really not going to be an issue.
Well, yeah, and you know, and our system as a default, a newly installed cloud solution or even an on-prem solution, by default does not store the voice, the actual speech itself. Now you can, you know, depending on the environment, in some environments, people may want to store the speech patterns for whatever reason, and if they need to, then they can turn that on. But as a default, we don't require the data, and we won't store it. And if you do store it, we recommend that you get it off the servers that have any type of outward connection. And therefore, that way it protects that data, because we don't need it. It's only for the only time people would want to record a conversation is if they want to go back and do some sort of quality control, or, you know, try and training or whatever like that. They may want to use that speech for that. But from a technology perspective, once we made the decision, we have all the vector data, we have all the probability scoring. We actually have a scoring model based on 1/10 of 1 second. So every 1/10 of 1 second we're scoring. So we can actually basically graph it and say, here's how your scoring model changed. And we can bring that to a court of law if you ever get into a dispute, and say, here's how it did it. Here's how we changed it. Here's what are the probabilities that we scored through the process. So we don't actually need to have that recording to prove anything.
Yeah, you actually kind of answered one of my questions, because as you were talking about how you plan to secure the data and remove that piece of wavelength from the audio file to remove any personal identifiers, I immediately thought to, I think it was back in 2016, Adobe released a program called Voco. I don't know if you've seen that, but it was the ability for, you could record your voice and they could edit it in real time, but they already had your vocal tone, so they essentially could create synthetic speech that wasn't there of your voice. So I'm just thinking, like, as secure as this would be to be able to authenticate via your voice, that's a lot of data you guys are holding on voice. So one of my questions was going to be, how do you plan to secure that? So I'm really happy to see that's, of course, 110% front and center for what you're doing, especially considering the technologies that are out there now that you can manipulate, biometric markers like that for people in real time.
Well, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that, I think our biggest advantage is coming from the industry that I come in from payments. I mean, it's kind of it's in the crosshairs of every hacker, because that's where the money is at and that's what they want to steal. So it's been a thing that we've been chasing, fraud and ID theft and all that for decades. So we have that mindset that we want to build things that are secure. But we also want to be ahead of the game, because we understand privacy. And I live in a kind of a really strange environment, because I love my privacy, but I'm building technology that can kind of almost work against that. So it's kind of it's a thought process that I go through every day when we're developing something new or putting something out of the market, to say that, look, if I was using this, I'd want to make sure that my privacy is protected. And that's why we do things like removing that middle section. So you can't really recreate speech out of that. Even to reverse engineer and find out what you said, you can't actually reverse engineer that speech.
Hey, Damon, this is Richard again. I have to leave myself. Someone just arrived at our house, and I've been attending them. But anyway, before I leave, I wanted to get this. I'm running like a million questions in my head, but one thing that you talked about was picking up stress levels, picking up any differences in the tone of the voice. I'm wondering what other demographic information, what other sort of unique identifiers of a person can you pick up from just the voice?
Well, I mean, I think that our immediate roadmap calls for a sentiment analysis, right? Trying to figure out how you're feeling. And then the next phase to that, I believe, is going into things like dialects. So can we start identifying dialects? Can we start identifying accents? And to me, we haven't really started working on that part yet because it's trying to figure out a value behind it, right? So is there value in the demographic? I don't know yet, but folks like yourselves who are actually developing the UI, the UX, the customer experience, can probably educate us more as to if you believe there's value, then that's something that we can drive towards. We obviously figured out that the sentiment itself has a lot of value, because if you can figure out whether someone's upset or happy, you can do a lot with them. But beyond that, if you're looking at things like dialects, so let me ask you a question. How would you use that information if I could tell you that, this is the heritage or whatever it is that you're looking for, or this is the dialect, this is the accent, what could you use that for?
I mean, I think that one thing that comes to mind right now is we're working on an education lab, and it is trying to inject more humanity into virtual classroom settings. And so we're looking to pick up the room, not just a single voice, but the voices in the room, and trying to identify who is in there if we can. The instructor may not be able to see them, but can interact with them and identify maybe age groups, maybe maybe where they're from in terms of a metropolitan area, what part of the city they're coming from. So it's not critical at this point. It's just like you were talking about. We're looking at ways to say how else can we improve the customer experience by identifying who they're talking to.
Right. So and towards that end, and that's something that I will certainly give it some thought, because one of the things that I figured was going to be needed, especially in this virtual world that we're working on right now, is this concept of diarization too. So if someone didn't have this video and they had just the audio for this meeting, there's been many people that have actually spoken. How can we diarize that conversation and say, well, Damian was speaking for this section, Richard was speaking for this section. And so we've actually developed an engine. We've actually got a diarization engine that we can just feed voice without any video, or even with video, and still diarize the voice itself and start picking out the different speakers within that conversation. So as we're getting more and more into these virtual conversations, I think that's the first phase in what you're talking about, is to pick out how many people are around in the first place. And then once you can diarize it, though, trying to figure out the accent or the language or the dialects within those languages, I don't believe it will be that hard, because the human brain can do it. And I work off this theory that if my brain can do it, we should be able to teach a computer how to do it, right? I mean, that was a question I was asking 20 years ago. And when I go and ask this from my engineers, they're going to say the same thing. You're nuts. What you need it. But eventually, I think that it sounds like there's some merit there, so it's something worth thinking about and putting it on a roadmap.
Yeah.
This is incredibly fantastic. I wish I could stay for the rest of this thing. I apologize. I did need to leave. But you guys, I will look forward to the rest of the recording for this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
All right.
Stay safe.
One thing
Bye-bye.
I have actually read about with being able to tell age, the age of a speaker, is then whether or not they start to change prosody, volume, and even potentially voice to accommodate any potential of kind of as you said, like as we age, different tones fall out, hearing challenges. So if, I know that this person is 70 plus based off their age, does that make it possible then for me to adjust how the speaker is responding? I think that would be incredibly helpful versus having to think it like today we do it manually, and we'll think, all right, who are these people, and try to guess. And sometimes we're right, and a lot of times we're not. And then we learn and optimize and optimize and optimize. If there was something that could help us actually know, and we're not just guessing and thinking we're doing the right thing, that would be phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and you know, there is actually I had a meeting this afternoon just before I got on this call with a doctor. We were talking about also cognitive tests. You know, how fast do you react to something?
Mm-hmm.
You know, we've learned all, you know, and when we learned the whole cognitive reality of where we live, it was kind of interesting because we actually had a situation where we had a system where it was asking the same question always. It was an app that asked the same question and we spoke. And we started realizing that we were starting to react. I couldn't pass at one point, and we thought the technology was broken. But what I found was that the more familiar I got with the app, I was speaking faster than the app was asking me the question. So it was cutting out the first few syllables of my speech, right? So when I explained this to this doctor today, and I said, well, so we can figure that out. And he was like, well, the reverse of that is really true, because as you age, your reaction time sometimes to an image could be slowing down. And could that be used then to try to, and maybe it's a combination of the way you speak, the tone in which you speak in, the reaction time you're taking to react to something we're showing on the screen, that can start identifying, you know, possibly starting to look at your age, your cognitive abilities and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of research coming down the road on this part, I think.
Yeah, the other thing that I could think of is like COPA laws, and having children under 13 getting information served up to them that they probably shouldn't. And so one of the big challenges that we've heard with voice is, so like, you know, we've got a 7-year-old son, like, how does Alexa know that they're actually talking to our son and not us? And if they're talking to our son, how would it actually know that he's restricted and he shouldn't have access to whatever, or he shouldn't be able to make purchases, or whatever the case might be? So, you know, the inverse, being able to identify a young child and say, you know, you don't have access to this part of it or whatever. And, you know, building that in for like parental controls or whatever that looks like would also be incredibly powerful.
Absolutely.
Because I think the big problem is when we create these experiences, we go, oh, we're creating it for 20-year-olds, but, you know, if 13-year-olds and under get into it, that's fine too. Like, we don't have to worry about it. And that's actually false. Like, we run into all kinds of issues with COPA and privacy. And if you're collecting that data, that's even worse. And so by being able to identify users, especially based on their, you know, the younger children's voice patterns, and just not collecting that data or whatever, would also be an incredibly powerful tool.
Or just not serving up certain advertising because they're in the room. I mean, that's been the thing that I've been struggling with the most is how do you do that if there's an adult but you don't know who else in the room, and then does that consider advertising to that everyone in the room or just the one person? And it's a slippery slope, but I know it's coming quickly. So how do we help make sure that we do show we're trying to go with right action, but we all know that, you know, that just because we thought of it isn't good enough. So it's nice to know that there might be some ways we can do that without it being I need you to tell me you're not a robot, or like, I mean, the clunky ways that CAPTCHA works. So having had to battle bots on many a form, I would love to not have to live that in the voice world.
Well, and that I think also still flows on to that whole sentiment analysis too, because as we're looking at understanding your sentiment, there's a lot of information we're capturing, because we're not just capturing speech at that point, we're actually capturing other patterns in your speech. So, you know, there's possibly some research we can do on that, definitely.
That's awesome.
Awesome.
Well, I think we're getting close to the end of our time. And Damian, thank you so much for all this information and for sharing all of your expertise. I think this has been an incredible conversation. I'm really glad that we have it recorded. I did want to give a few moments in the last. If I think that we're probably good, but I want to open up the floor if there were any other topics, and then wanted to kind of introduce what we'll be talking about next time we get together. By the way, Damian, while we're doing that, if anyone wants to talk to you, what is the best way to get a hold of you, or if they have any questions?
I could probably out through the chat here put out my my email and my phone number. That's probably the best way. Or you can reach us through our website, which is I'll provide all those three right now.
Awesome.
And I think if anyone wants to leave their contacts in the chat so that we can all connect afterwards, that would be great. I know some people already reached out to me on LinkedIn, but if you want to leave your contact in the chat, that'd be great.
Yeah.
So with that, we have a few minutes where we can just open it up to the floor, and if there's anything else question-wise related to security, privacy, or whatever else voice related, we can talk about that now. And if not, we can just kind of wrap things up.
I had one question.
Yeah.
How do you, for Damian, how do you account for those that have, from an accessibility standpoint, those that may have a speech impediment or they can't speak, or even someone with laryngitis? How do you account for authenticating someone who may not be able to speak?
Well, in those situations, so if they can't speak at all, and that falls into, you have to work in these environments on the 99, 98 to 1% rule, right? So you try to get the majority of people through the system as efficiently as possible, and then deal with the anomalies or the outliers. So if you can't speak, or you have a problem with speech, you have laryngitis, then you would have to revert back to traditional methods. Yeah,
okay.
I either try to figure out remember a password, try to reset a password, make a phone call, whatever it is, because there is limitations to anything we do. I mean, with whatever biometric it is, there's always going to be a limitation. And so the idea here is to really focus on that 99% of the people that we can get through the system efficiently, provide them the great experience, and then deal with the rest.
Thank you.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our first virtual UVS Chicago Meetup. So thank you, everyone, for attending. Or if you signed up and watching this video afterwards, thank you for watching.
Yep.
In the next topic that we're going to discuss in the UVS Chicago Meetup is actually going to be the idea around designing voice experiences. And so that could be a host of different things, from personas to conversation to design to really anything that's related to design. So we're looking forward to a very robust conversation. And I think this format works really well, especially for virtual. So be on the lookout for the next invitation. We'll post the information in here in the next week or so to the meetup page, so you can actually sign up for it. And then finally, if you have any questions or comments, or just want to get a hold of any of us, Colin wasn't able to be with us today. He had a family issue. But here's all of our contact information. So, for Susan and myself, I can say, if you find us on Twitter, we're on Twitter all the time, we're on LinkedIn all the time, or if you want to email us. And then, for Jeremy and Colin, that's the way they get a hold of them as well. So